a history of a Western nation. It might be something that you'd have to look for, or it wouldn't be as on the surface. But in Russian history, the mystical, the apocalyptic, the spiritual, the otherworldly is at the heart of it.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 4 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we're going to endeavor to unpack the mystery of Russia. My guest is Gary Lachman, well-known historian of esoteric culture who has been on New Thinking Aloud many times in the past. Viewers will know that Gary has written books about Carl Jung, Emanuel Swedenborg, Helena Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, about the Hermetic tradition, and many others, including, of course, Dark Star Rising, his book about politics and the occult. He is recently the author of The Return of Holy Russia, Apocalyptic History, Mystical Awakening, and the Struggle for the Soul of the World. I know for myself that Russia has often been referred to as a riddle wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in an enigma, and now we are going to attempt to unpack that riddle. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I will switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Jeffrey.
And I'm so excited about your book. I'll tell you why. I myself am 100% Russian Jewish ancestry. So,
well, there you go.
Yeah, this is really an eye-opener for me to delve into the various labyrinths of what it means to be Russian in today's world. And really, your book has opened it up for me more than anything else I've actually ever encountered. Not that I've encountered a lot, but I guess it's strange because Russian history isn't nearly as ancient as Greek or Egyptian or even Roman history, and yet it's so very complex.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's only over a little over 1,000 years old. I mean, give or take a century or two. But yeah, it is nothing but. It's almost as if it is history rather than it has a history, because it has everything. It has all these apocalyptic moments and vast migrations and catastrophes and revolutions and assassinations and all of that. And there never seems to be a quiet moment. Although it does seem to fluctuate between these sort of kind of times when there's a kind of somnolence about it, then a sudden eruption. So it's quite the roller coaster ride.
And one of the interesting points that you maintain is that an important part of the Russian identity, especially today, is this idea of Eurasia, a kind of synthesis of East and West.
Yeah, this is an idea going back before just around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. And there were some Russian intellectuals who weren't happy with the Bolsheviks. They also didn't like the Tsar. And they thought that the revolution would be short-lived. And they left Russia and became exiles in Europe. And they had this idea that once the revolution collapsed, which they felt sure it was going to fairly soon, they would return, and what they would return with this new identity for Russia, in the sense that it's not a European country, it's not a kind of backward cousin of Europe, which it's usually been considered, but it's a completely different and unique and original civilization in itself. And they took this notion of Eurasia, and it's supposed to be, the land stretching from basically, the eastern part of Europe all the way to the Pacific and all of that. And it had its own culture, it had its own identity, it's had its own destiny. And that didn't work because the Bolshevik Revolution didn't collapse. But since the collapse of the USSR in the 1990s, this idea has come back and become very popular.
One of the intriguing things to me is that there's a strong thread of mysticism that runs through Russian tradition, and you, of course, being a historian of esoteric culture, have emphasized that. But there are many different variations and varieties of Russian mysticism.
Oh, this is true, and it's not as if you would have to go out of your way to find it, which perhaps a history of a Western nation might be something that you'd have to look for, or it wouldn't be as on the surface. But in Russian history, the mystical, the apocalyptic, the spiritual, the otherworldly is at the heart of it, and it's mostly associated with their adoption of the Greek Orthodox Church, but there was a pagan Russian identity and soul before that as well, which today is having a comeback again with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s and this kind of new freedom, in a word, in Russia. A lot of religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs and teachings and things of that sort that had been banned or making a comeback. And this early paganism is one of them, just as the return to the church as well.
And I guess another important thread, and I know we'll have a chance to go into more depth on all of these, but there was a period in which Russia was really invaded by and dominated by the Mongol Empire.
Yeah, this was something that's called the Mongol yoke. And it's sort of in the 1200s into maybe about the 1400s, around there. And it was, it's something that is in the mix of the Russian soul, as we know it today, which manages to combine many different sort of identities and characteristics and traits, which you mentioned. It's a huge, capacious kind of character, the Russian. It's able to embrace contradictory things, and some of this supposed Asiatic sensibility comes from the time when they were under the Mongol yoke, and this was the case for quite a few centuries. And one of the interesting things about the Mongols was that they would dominate you, but they wouldn't force you to abandon your religion. I mean, they themselves had a shamanistic sort of religion. Genghis Khan was a Tengrist, which was a sort of shamanic religion and sensibility, but they would allow the conquered people to maintain their own. So in a way, during the time of the Mongol yoke, this was when the fusion really between the Russian soul and the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox Church became, because it was something that they had to hold on to keep their Russianness, as it were.
Since you mentioned the Russian Orthodox Church, virtually everybody knows that iconic cathedral. I think it's the Cathedral of St. Basil there in Red Square in Moscow. It sort of symbolizes Russia, and it is a very unique piece of architecture. It also, I suppose one would have to say, the Russian Orthodox Church is a unique religion, but it actually has its origins in the Byzantine Church.
Well, yes, it goes back to Constantinople, which was the second Rome. And well, there's a whole myth about the Third Rome, where Moscow has taken on the mantle of being the Third Rome. There was the first Rome, obvious, the Rome, and then when that fell, Constantinople, which was the head or the capital of the Eastern Empire, that carried on for quite some time, but it fell in 1453 to the Turks. And then it was that point that Moscow, although it was still under domination by the Mongols and is on its way to freeing itself, it took on this mantle of being the Third Rome, and that myth is kind of coming back into play again today as part of this attempt on contemporary Russia to embrace this religious holy identity.
And I think to really understand it, you've really laid out what Byzantium meant to the people of that era. For most people today, the very concept of Byzantium is sort of lost in history. It's gone now. But at one time, it was a very powerful force, not just a political and geopolitical force, but it inspired many poets.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a famous poem by W.B. Yeats, Sailing to Byzantium. And for Yeats, Byzantium, it symbolized this kind of culture, spiritual culture that ran throughout the entire society. And I mean, maybe in the sense that you would think of the ancient Egyptian society was like that too. Something, from the everyday items to the pyramids, there was a kind of continuum of a spiritual kind of sensibility, and this was something that Yeats saw in Byzantium as well, and it became this kind of symbol for him, a kind of a perfection, a kind of holy perfection on earth. And this was how it appeared to the early Russians who went there. The story is that Princess Olga, who was the mother of Vladimir I, or the grandmother of Vladimir I, who would later adopt Greek Orthodox Christianity as the Russian national religion. She traveled from Kiev, which was the Russian capital at that time, to Constantinople, and she was completely overwhelmed by the beauty. By Hagia Sophia, the domed, biggest building on earth at the time, these fantastic pillars, and just this marvelous sense of spiritual beauty. And she was absolutely convinced by it, and through all the rites, this was something that really affected the Russian soul. They were convinced of the importance or the significance of the Greek Orthodox religion because of the beautiful rites, because of the beautiful rituals, the beautiful ceremonies. It transported them. It gave them a taste of this transfigured world. And this became this is kind of the essence, the nut of the apocalyptic kind of strain in them, because they've had a taste of this world that's completely transformed. And they believe the whole idea of the second coming, this was on its way.
And the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Byzantium Church, was really part of a theocratic state in effect.
Oh, yeah, as I said, it's from top to bottom. It was something that ran completely through it. And I mean, there's stories of people going there that, I forget the name of the traveler, but he said he went, and I think it was Gregory of Nicaea, when or Nicaea, he went and he wanted to just buy a loaf of bread, and it would turn into a theological argument. So there was something that it was something that, just ran throughout the whole culture. Very much unlike, our world today, which is fragmented and fractured and doesn't have that seamless unity.
Now, and another point you made that I found very interesting is that when the first Russian state, I guess you'd have to call it, based in Kiev, in effect converted from their Slavic Nordic pagan religion to the Christian church. At that time, many of the theological disputes that had sort of split the Roman Empire and caused all sorts of divisiveness had been settled, so that the Russians inherited a very set way of thinking in which people believed they had the truth.
Yeah, there didn't seem to be quite the continuous sort of disputes as you have in the Western Church and the Eastern. They seem to have adopted a dogma and a teaching. And as you say, that was pretty much set in stone, as it were. And the Russians who adopted it, they saw it as their mission or their job to protect that, to keep it intact, to keep, to protect the holy and the sacred. And this was this notion of the Third Rome. So there wasn't the idea about having any debate about the meaning of all these sorts of things. It already was there. And in a sense, that was very good because it allowed them to adopt something, and it completely inform the culture rather than create greater schisms and all that.
One of the unique features of the Russian Orthodox Church or the Greek Orthodox or the Byzantium Church, I guess in a sense they're all the same, is the emphasis on the apocalypse. I know it exists as well in the Western Church, but it really seems to be emphasized in Eastern Orthodoxy.
Well, as I say in the book, the Russian soul, it didn't give lip service to the apocalypse, which is something that you could say in the West. Not to say that there weren't outbreaks of millennial, beliefs in different times in the West. We all know that they were, but it was something that, again, it was like very much a part of the culture. It wasn't something that sort of, okay, we have to make a place for this. It was at the center of it. And it has to do also with the notion of resurrection. So Easter is a more important holiday on the Russian church than Christmas. And, to sort of say it in a facetious way, I mean, everybody gets born, but not everybody comes back from the dead. And so this is this whole notion of transfiguration. It's a kind of power over life. It's a power over this world that we are, in now, this veil of tears. And it also gave this sense of direction to history, which is, if you think of where the Russian people are, coming into being geographically, out in the steppes and all that, it's a vast kind of, total horizon around you. And prior to adopting Christianity, I mean, the sense of time was cyclical at best. It was a seasonal change and all that. And you have the nomadic peoples always constantly on the move. And then suddenly you have this notion by one of the peoples being adopted of a kind of straight line in history, and there's a direction that it's going to. And this apocalyptic fervor, it's tied up with, Nikolai Berdyaev is the Russian philosophers I write about in the book, and he says the Russians, they're not a people of compromise. They're not a people of the middle path. It's either yes or no, one way or the other. So it's either the millennium or the abyss. And so they're always sort of going back and forth between kind of the collapse and catastrophe and the sense of a rebirth. And there's something in the soul where the rebirth won't happen until the old is washed away, is knocked away. And so this whole notion of the apocalypse, the collapse of this false world around us, giving way to the new world, this is something that's very much a part of their whole belief.
And I'm under the impression that this kind of apocalyptic thinking is very active today in the minds of Russians, and particularly Russian leaders.
Well, I mean, there's one person in the book that I mentioned. I wrote about him a bit more in my previous book, Dark Star Rising, which is about Trump and occult politics. But it's this fellow Alexander Dugin, who has had one of the strangest trajectories in modern political culture. He started out in the 1980s as a anti-Soviet sort of punk dissident, and I don't know if he still is, but within recent times he was lecturing on geopolitics to the general staff at the Kremlin, and so he became quite the insider from the opposite. But he has this vision of a kind of coming final war between the East and the West, or between what he calls Eurasia. He's one of the promoters of this Eurasia meme we were talking about earlier, and what he calls the Atlanticist countries or nations, and these are all the seafaring so the Western, so the Great Britain and the United States and so on. And there's some fundamental elemental clash there, between the solid heartland, the mother of all continents, the largest landmass on the planet, and the fluid, ever-changing, watery world. And that's the democratic, liberal, progressive world, which is constantly changing and in motion and in becoming. And then the heartland is the land of tradition. It's the land of the fixed values and absolute values and all that. So he sees this kind of clash happening, and how much Putin himself has bought into it is debatable. But he seems to have taken on the rhetoric of this kind of confrontational sense between the sort of decadent West and the traditional East. And there is the sense where it's kind of like, yes, Russia is an up and coming. We're not a new nation. We're a new civilization. That's the thing. Russia is, and again, as far as I understand, in Russian history, it's always been an empire. It's only in this Russia we know today that it's a separate nation. You've always had a Russian empire. So there's always this notion of vast lands, being under the umbrella of Mother Russia. And there's still that sensibility today. I mean, this is what sort of Russia Putin is talking about.
Well, one of the ways in which you begin your book, interestingly to me, is you refer to an important esoteric metaphysical thinker about whom we've talked in the past, Rudolf Steiner. And Steiner himself seemed to have a vision for a unique synthesis of Eastern and Western culture, and he saw the Russians as potentially a vanguard with regard to that synthesis.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, Steiner gave a series of lectures in a suburb of Paris in 1906. There was a big theosophical jamboree in Paris then. And he was supposed to have given a series of lectures in Russia itself the year before, but the 1905 revolution made that impossible. And so many Russians came to Paris for this theosophical conference, and many of the leading figures in what subsequently became known as the Russian Silver Age. This was this period from about 1890 to the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution. And it was this remarkable flowering of creativity, and it was also informed a lot of mystical and occult and magical and spiritual ideas, hence their interest in Steiner. But Steiner had this vision that this new cultural epoch, sort of the first kind of feelers of the next change, the next great shift in human consciousness, the beginnings of it could be seen in the Russian people. And because the task of the West was to develop the I, the separate individual I, the ego. And this was something that the West had done and achieved. And for Steiner, in a way, it had achieved it too well, because it had perfected this Western separate, distinct ego, and it had lost contact with its source in the spiritual worlds and nature and all of that. And this new cultural epoch was supposed to somehow redeem that and rectify the situation. He could see that happening there in Russia, and many of the Russians who he was lecturing to felt the same way. They felt that there was this new kind of religious spiritual consciousness, and it was all about the idea of this kind of integral being, uniting the Western science with Eastern mysticism. And again, Russia was supposed to be this place where the two things came together. And, yes, and Steiner talks about the masculine West and the feminine East have to come together and give birth to this, this new child of the new epoch. And, but sadly, what happened instead was, the Bolshevik Revolution took place. But oddly enough, in the very early days of the Bolshevik Revolution, there were a lot of anthroposophical groups that were kind of fellow travelers with it. They thought that perhaps, this new age, that Lenin was bringing in could be a way to introduce some of these ideas, but it turned out to be not the case.
I suppose it's fair to say that during the 70 years or so of communist domination of Russia, that although the Russian Orthodox Church survived, there was definitely an anti-religious movement within the government itself.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, Lenin made it absolutely clear that his mission, or the success of the revolution depended on this eradication of what he called inwardness. Just eradicating the whole inner world. The whole idea there's some inner world that is some way different than the material world around us. I mean, he was an utter materialist and physicalist in the way. There's nothing like the soul and all of that. And so yes, the church came under great pressure and was almost put out of business completely. And there was also this famous story of what's known as the philosophy steamer. And these were two boats that on which Lenin had put all of these philosophers and religious thinkers and writers and historians that he didn't want to just eradicate because he thought the press would be too bad. But he also they couldn't be around. And many of these people were people that prior to the Bolshevik sort of dominance, they too were, critical of the Tsar, and they were, trying to effect changes in society and all that. But no, they were sort of prophets of inwardness. They were sort of philosophers of this notion of the spirit or something like that, and so he had to get rid of them. So yeah, that's how it started. And in a way, it's not radically different from the West idea of consciousness or the mind. The whole idea is that it's tabula rasa. There's nothing in here. I mean, in a lot of my talks, I say like the basic Western view of the psyche is it's like an empty flat or an empty apartment, and you have to go to an IKEA and you buy a bunch of stuff and you bring it back, and then your flat is furnished. So with us, it's like we John Locke said many years ago or centuries ago, there's nothing in the mind that wasn't there for what didn't get there through the senses. So anything in here comes in through the senses, and Lenin was completely sold on that, as was the West. It's just that the West turned out to be more consumerist than Russia at that time. But this carried on throughout most of the early days of the revolution. But funnily enough, by the late 1920s, there was a very active operation with the communists there to study early parapsychological studies, and there was even this remarkable attempt by two people to get funding to go on a journey to Tibet to find theosophical masters who have this mystical knowledge, but also have this mystical technology as well. So, I mean, this was actually getting funded. And there's the remarkable story of Nicholas Roerich, the great Russian painter and mystic, who was trying to establish a independent pan-Buddhist nation in the center of Central Asia, using the myth of Shambhala and all that. So, I mean, these are stories that I tell in the book, but they give you an idea of actually what's going on at the time. It was quite remarkable.
I think it's worth mentioning in the context of Nicholas Roerich that at the same time that Russia is turning toward a more atheistic outlook, you have people like Gurdjieff and Blavatsky emerging from Russia and sort of reinvigorating the Western interest in the metaphysics and the occult.
Absolutely. I mean, Blavatsky's a bit earlier, but you certainly, around the time of the revolution, you have there's Roerich, who, he's become world famous already because, he was the set designer and the artist for The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky's ballet that sort of kickstarted the age of modern music and all that. And then he had a very successful career as a painter. And so, I mean, he wound up living in New York, and there was even a skyscraper that he owned on West End Drive, and there's a wonderful Roerich museum there. But Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous, which is the basic go-to book about Gurdjieff's ideas, but it's also this wonderful adventure story of them fleeing this collapsing Russia. They're going from Moscow and St. Petersburg all the way, through the revolution, World War I, then the revolution, then the Civil War, and then they're washed ashore as these emigres on. Well, we talked about Constantinople. It was still Constantinople. It was about to turn into Istanbul. Yeah, and so I mean, they found themselves like people today on the outskirts of Europe trying to get in. With all the other immigrants from the war, the refugees, and all that. And but yes, I mean, and Ouspensky was a virulent anti-Bolshevik. There's a little collection called Letters from Russia, 1919. And these were letters that he wrote to A.R. Orage, who was the editor of The New Age, which was this journal in the early 1919s and 20s in here in London. And Ouspensky was saying all these Westerners were very sympathetic to the Great Russian experiment and all that. Let them come here and they'll actually see what it's about, because everyone is just starving. This social cohesion is completely broken down and collapsed, and the soldiers are shooting people left and right and all that. So he had no love of the Tsar, Ouspensky, because his sister was arrested and thrown into prison by the Tsar, but not personally, but during the regime. But he didn't like the Bolsheviks either. But yes, I mean that it kind of squeezed all these people out. I mean, I mentioned Nicholas Berdyaev. He was another one. This very, very interesting character who starts out as a Marxist, but he becomes a Christian and an existentialist. So he's like a Marxist Christian existentialist, and his central idea is is freedom, this whole notion of freedom. And he's one of the ones who's on the philosophy steamer and booted out. So Lenin kind of squeezed out all of the the best and the brightest many ways. It's not that different in some ways, with the Nazis, because all of the great, Jewish intellectuals fled Germany then and wound up in New York or California.
Yeah. One figure you didn't write about, but who had a big influence on me, who was exiled by Lenin, is Pitirim Sorokin, who founded the Department of Sociology, or it was called Social Relations at Harvard University. And I consider him to be a great mystical thinker who even today, the American Sociological Society gives the Pitirim Sorokin Award to, the best work of the year in sociology.
Well, that'll have to wait till the next edition. I'll have to add it in.
Yeah. Well, there's another interesting thread, and let me couch it this way, Gary. Another person who's a big inspiration to me is the filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky. Again, Russian Jewish ancestry, I think, or Slavic Jewish ancestry. And in his metaphysical movies, he once pointed out, he said, you can't talk about spirituality without talking about violence. His movies like El Topo and The Magic Mountain are filled with violent imagery, and that seems to be very deeply ingrained in the Russian mind, this mixture of spirituality and violence.
I think you can chalk it up to this contradictory nature of the Russian soul. In early chapter of the book, I write about Russian man, and Russian man is it was a theme. I mean, I referred to a specific essay by the German novelist Hermann Hesse that was published in 1919. So when I was writing the book, it was a century earlier. And it's ostensibly an essay about Dostoevsky and his novels, the Brothers Karamazov and such. But it's in his novels that he sees this character, and it's this kind of antinomian saint and sinner. He's a poet, he's a drunkard, he's a criminal, he's a judge, he's a hero, he's a villain. And Russian women as well, a goddess and a whore or whatever. And it's this strange mix. And I guess the archetypal figure of this would be someone like Rasputin, who, I mean, there's a lot of myths and stories have accreted around Rasputin's life and all that. But one of the earliest books, it's, Rasputin, the holy devil. The biker gang, the Hells Angels, is the same kind of thing. This notion of the two opposites coming together, and Dostoevsky has all these characters that somehow are able to embrace both sides. It's this kind of it's Hesse calls it this kind of fearful sort of total sanctity, which I'm paraphrasing it, but it's a kind of way in which you see everything as holy, but even violence, even crime, even some kind of degradation and something of that sort. And it's not quite exactly the same thing, but, in Dostoevsky's novels, I mean, this kind of humiliation, this kind of masochism is often a way that some of the characters transform and become, bigger selves and that kind of thing. They adopt a suffering and a punishment, often for some crime they haven't committed, or again, crime and punishment. There you go. I mean, it's really a thriller. I mean, Dostoevsky was writing these things and paying off his gambling debts by, each week for the newspapers, and it's kind of like a page turner thriller. And he uses this whole theme of murder, to pose these ultimate kinds of questions, these ultimate yes or ultimate no. If nothing is true, is everything permitted? Well, if that's the case, then I should be able to kill this nasty old, pawnbroker lady here and just take her money because I'm a higher type and she's nothing. She's just an insect. And he finds that he can't do it. But it's taking it to the edge. It's kind of taking things to the edge. It's this notion, again, like the Russians are just not lukewarm. It's either all or nothing.
You earlier referred to Olga, the Russian queen who converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, and she herself is sort of an archetypal character, a woman who seemed to be very devout and yet at the same time committed many violent atrocities.
Well, I guess it was a tough world back then. So yes, I mean, there's the stories that some of these characters, they convert because they've sinned so much in the past, and Christianity allows them a way, in some way, to redeem for this bloody past they have. But no, there's all these remarkable stories about her and this revenge she took for the murder of her husband and things of that sort, where she very coolly and just invites people to a feast or something like that, and then when they're all kind of drunk and everything, her guards come in and just slaughter them and things of that sort. And just it's it's like that. Or again, you think of someone like Ivan the Terrible, who's another kind of cliched figure of the Russian tyrant, but he was they say that terrible really means the dreaded, but still, terrible, I think, fits more than once in his choices. There's the story where he walled in Moscow's rival city, Novgorod, which is traditionally seen to be a more liberal, kind of progressive in Western terms, sort of Russian political system than the sort of Tsar and all that. But there was some perceived slight. He felt that the city had made against him, and he walled them in, and he slaughtered something like 40,000 people. But when he left, when he abandoned, Moscow and said, "Okay, I've had it," and the people came after him. They followed him in droves, and they begged him to return, and he did. Only on his terms, which was absolute obedience, to everything I say. I say in the book that he is a good example of what the British writer Colin Wilson called the right man, which is this kind of dominant alpha male who is incapable of ever admitting that he's wrong. I mean, that's true of many of us, I know, but there are some that it's even more true. They're more right than we are. And Ivan the Terrible seems to be one of these characters. And he was like, as I say, unfortunately, it was the right man in the right place for him, because he was able to exercise this complete dominance and control over the lives of all his people. And he sort of introduced the first kind of police state with the oprichniki. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, but yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't he also the one who built the St. Basil's Cathedral?
Oh yeah. So you have these, it's these tremendous expressions of violence and just kind of evil, we would say, sadism, and then to atone for that, you have this fantastic, beautiful church being made, or some kind of penance, some kind of pilgrimage. You walk barefoot, whatever, 50 miles or something somewhere. Again, going backtracking a little bit, with this whole pilgrimage was another central idea in the Russian psyche. Going on these incredibly long, journeys. I mean, Rasputin walked thousands and thousands of miles to get to Mount Athos, in Greece, and he took a side trip to Jerusalem and things like that. And again, that the vastness of the Russian land, the terrain, and somehow this notion of this kind of pilgrimage, just like straight line through it, that to me gives a sense of the history as well, in this kind of spatial sense. Okay, there's a journey you're making, and you're on the way to somewhere. The journey. So history, our life is so. I mean, it's a metaphor or an analogy it's made before, but our life is like a pilgrimage in the same kind of way. So that those two things, the spatial and the temporal, seem to come together for me there.
Now, in your book, you sort of describe two different Russian types. You talk about the new man, who is rather materialistic, atheistic. I think they were promoted during the communist era. But there's also the more sentimental Russian type with mystical inclinations. And one thing that struck me is that there's a way in which these two types of individuals come together. And I think I saw that in the description of the Russian cosmists, who were quite influential.
Yeah, well, the new men start around the later part of the 19th century, and they are these very utilitarian, pragmatic, practical. I mean, they're kind of more West than the Westerners, but they're tired of all the previous generation's romantic ideals. There's this notion of the beautiful soul, and this was supposed to be some individual character who had become almost saintly, and he would affect change by example. He would radiate a kind of goodness that others would pick up and follow, and things of that sort. And they just got completely impatient with anything like that, and they saw the only way that anything was going to change, and what was supposed to change, the central thing that was supposed to change, was the plight of the serfs. The serfs were, sort of like slaves in America or elsewhere, but in absolutely, horrible conditions, and they were owned, by the landowners and all that. And hundreds of years, the serfs needed to be freed and all that, and it just never got around to doing it. And so the new men just got completely tired of these old romantic notions, and they just said, they ruthless, people that are willing to do what was necessary in order to make the change. And yes, when the Bolsheviks, they took quite a few pages from the new men's sensibility when they did it, and this whole idea of a kind of elite, a revolutionary elite who were trained to take power and to hold it, and all of that sort of thing. And but yeah, I said this other type, which is more mystical and has a sense of the grandeur and mystery and awe and wonder of the universe is something there too. I mean, the cosmists were. There's this remarkable character, Fyodor Fedorov, again, who's in the late 19th century, and he was friends with Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy respected him, and he had this remarkable one single idea. Was he took the idea of the resurrection of the dead literally, from Christianity. Not in some spiritual sense or some kind of transfigured sort of sense, but the idea that he called it the common task, and this would be something that would unite all the peoples of the earth. If we only recognize that somehow we owed it to the dead to find a way to bring them back to life. He didn't know how it would happen, but he realized that this would be the one idea that would unite everyone. And it sounds absolutely mad, from our perspective today, but he said there should be a way to recollect all of the particles, the dust particles of all the bodies that have, decomposed over time, and somehow to put them back together. And then because there'd be so many more people alive, we'd have to go out and explore space, because we'd have to find other planets that were inhabitable, because there'd be no more room on the earth and all this. And I mean, the idea is just open up in this vast kind of cathedral of kind of visionary future. And he is tangentially responsible for the whole Russian space program. There was one of his students, Silovsky, if I can't pronounce his name correctly right now. He was actually behind the early Russian rocket science, as it were, and all that. And so, I mean, there's museums, monuments, and things of that sort dedicated to these people. And this was this remarkable vision of spreading out into the universe, spreading out in the farthest galaxy, this kind of Star Trek sort of thing, or what we, the anthropic universe sort of notion. I think it was Frank Tipler, but the whole idea of shooting out, computers out into space or something like that. So yeah, the cosmos, they were thinking of that 100 years ago.
Yeah, and Frank Tipler, incidentally, also writes about the resurrection of the dead inside of a computer.
There you go. Well, there's only a few good ideas around. They get a lot of variations on them. So, yeah.
Well, I guess we really should touch on Russian parapsychology as well. I know back in 1970 or so, when the book Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain came out, it was a bestseller, and frankly, it was one of the influences on me that sort of provoked me to pursue an academic degree in parapsychology.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was something that seemed to be a great revelation when that book was published, and there was a follow-up to it as well, and then the whole idea about the Curlean photography, and I forget the Russian woman's name who was the telekinesis, so she had the PK powers.
Nina Kalagina.
That's right, yeah, she was able to move, and again, this was supposed to have been picked up by the Russian intelligence services, much like it was happening in the West as well. I mean, one of the interesting things about that came out while I was writing the book was that the Esalen Institute in California, that they had in the 80s and early 90s, they had set up this sort of independent cultural exchange program with like-minded people in Russia, and it wasn't through the government. So although I think at one point, CIA and all these other sorts of people were involved in that, and they were meeting. I mean, Michael Murphy talks about how when he went there, he was meeting the same kinds of people that would come to Esalen. People interested in the spirituality and paranormal and all that sort of thing. But he said they were more out in the open. They were more sort of it wasn't regarded as anything that strange. And there's this wonderful story about how Esalen was responsible for bringing Boris Yeltsin over to the States. He didn't go to Esalen, but they kind of ferried him around, or representatives from Esalen ferried him around to different sorts of places, and he met, different people. And I think he met Reagan, who was in the hospital, NASA or something like that. But there's a story where he said, "Stop the car. I want to go to an American supermarket." Because all my life I've been told that this is just propaganda, these wonderful shelves filled with all this kind of produce and everything, and I want to see for myself. And they said, yeah, sure. So they just pulled into some supermarket somewhere. And as they say here, he was gobsmacked. He couldn't believe it was true. And then apparently he said, we have to take to another one, just to make sure this one wasn't set up. And then he was convinced that, communism had been lying, to him all his life. And so this was sort of the beginning of the end for the USSR. So, this interest in parapsychology and the paranormal and human potential that transcended national boundaries, tangentially, in some way, had an effect that led to massive change in history.
Gary, you've written a huge book. I think it's over 450 pages, and we've just barely scratched the surface of all the many important thinkers that have come out of Russia and have touched on these things. All I can say is, we'd have to do 10 more interviews to begin to cover it all. I want to encourage our viewers to read your book, The Return of Holy Russia, if they really want to go into depth and into the many diverse threads that are available. But this has been a delightful conversation, and I think we've been able to give our viewers a good overview of the complexity of the Russian character.
One of the things that I so enjoyed about doing this book is that I knew just the tiniest bit about Russian history, mostly around the revolution, and so it was all new terrain for me, and I just was absolutely fascinated to find out everything about it. And so I think I put in the excitement of discovery into the writing of the book as well. So I hope people explore it, and I hope they find it an enjoyable journey.
Well, I'm sure they will, and I once again want to highly recommend it. I think that it's probably your best book to date. As a matter of fact, from my point of view, it takes your literary powers to a whole new level.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeffrey. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Thank you for being with me, Gary. It's been a real pleasure.
Me as well. Thank you. Spasibo.
Book 4 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.